Now, our guest, Andrew D. BASIAGO, is a lawyer, writer. He is the president and founder of the Mars Anomaly Research Society. Andy founded the Mars Anomaly Research Society in 2008 after discovering evidence of life in a photograph of the red planet being back to Earth by NASA's Mars Exploration Rover Spirit. Andy is an emerging figure in the disclosure movement, who is leading a campaign to lobby the United States government to disclose such controversial truths as the fact that Mars harbors life and that the United States has achieved quantum access to the past and future events. His discovery of life on Mars is a huge event in history. His crusade to evaluate and prove his findings and bring them to public life has been called heroic. It is with great pleasure Other World Radio would like to welcome Andrew D. BASIAGO. Andy, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here, Sandy. Good to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent. Andy, there's so much to cover in the time that you're with us tonight, and I'm assuming our listeners have some background on you. Let's just start with the discoveries made by you in the Mars Anomaly Research Society this past year as a sort of year-end review and working up to your latest developments. Let's start where you feel comfortable beginning our journey tonight.
Great, Sandy. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this retrospective tonight. I think where we might start it is at December 12th of last year, because it was on 12/12/08 that I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. And the significance of that work is that it was the first written work to prove that Mars is an inhabited planet. The paper is an analysis of a single photograph taken by NASA's Mars Exploration Rover Spirit, a photo captioned PIA 10214, or as a growing number of people in the Mars Anomaly Research community are calling 10214. This image is a westward view of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin of the Gusev crater of Mars that was taken by Spirit from the western edge of the home plate plateau. And you may recall that I declared back in December of last year, at the time that I essentially evaluated my year of discovery in 2008 and published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, that 10214 is the most significant photograph that's ever been taken by human beings from Earth. And the reason I said that at that time was because it literally contains a cosmic treasure trove of photographic evidence of life on Mars, including such things as humanoid beings, different animal species, carved statues, and also several built structures. And I might add that over the course of the last year, I continue to receive inquiries and new leads from individuals around the world, literally from some of the countries that you mentioned in your introduction, in which individuals are finding new data just in this one photograph. So this is a profoundly historically significant photograph, and I'm in fact calling for an international commission to be founded just to evaluate the data in this particular photograph.
Okay. Andy, one of the questions that we've gotten submitted to us is basically what has inspired your research when you wrote the paper, Discovery of Life on Mars? If you can kind of preset that for us, so people that may not know too much about you or just tune in tonight, kind of get them up to speed just a little bit before we progress.
Well, this image was taken in November of 2007 by the Spirit, and it was beamed back to Earth in January of 2008. And like a lot of individuals around the world, I was intrigued by the fact that there was public scrutiny given a small anomaly over on the far left edge of the home plate plateau, and for that matter, the far leftward edge of the photograph. Mm-hmm. Because the photograph, essentially, the Spirit was sitting on the western edge of a plateau, and it's looking to the west and capturing a vast view of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin of Mars. And I was captivated by the fact that this anomaly could be a natural rock formation or possibly a statue, or it could even be something we had never seen before, namely the image of a humanoid being on another planet. So in January of 2008, when this image was first published, I analyzed it actually for several hours. It sort of became my hobby. You know, I'm a trial lawyer by profession, and during my quiet hours away from my law practice, I began to study this anomaly. And I concluded rather quickly there in January, February of '08 that it was a statue. And the reason I say that is because it's standing on a pedestal. And because they need pedestals to stand upright, having a pedestal, is one of the characteristics of statuary.
Mm-hmm.
But there were many other characteristics that I found as someone who, when I was studying environmental law at the University of Cambridge, every once in a while I would audit a class in art history or archaeology, because archaeology has always been one of my primary hobbies, something I've always stayed abreast of. And I noticed that there were many characteristics of statuary in this anomaly. For example, the fact that it possessed highly articulated human form, that the image of the standing female corresponded orthographically to the statue element consisting of a male lying prone, probably as a result of breaking off from the female form and sliding down the hillside. I noticed that this anomalous set of human forms possessed clothing, unlike any natural form on Earth in which we impute human form to, in the pareidolia effect. We tend to see human faces and things that aren't faces, and human forms and things that have just been carved by the wind or waves and so forth. But I was intrigued by the fact that these two human forms possessed clothing, they possessed movement, and so I wrote about that in my paper in December of 2008, but very early in 2008, I was not just convinced, but I think I had proved that by identifying all the characteristics that this was a statue on the planet Mars. Now, statues require statue makers, and so that meant that intelligent life had to either once exist on Mars as a result of intelligent life visiting Mars or living on Mars, or intelligent life had to exist on Mars today. Those are the only three options to explain a statue on another planet, a statue of humans, of the human form divine, as William Blake spoke of it. And so throughout 2008, I scrutinized different parts of the image. It's a vast image of literally a valley. And NASA, I would find, has been altering color and brightness and contrast, and also most particularly scale. It's been taking photographs of very large geographic areas and then condensing them into small photographs. But most of the small details are simply not visible to the naked eye as a result of compression. And so I developed a technique whereby I imported PIA 10214 into my picture editor in my Windows Vista operating system. And then I excised small portions of the photograph and dropped them into a Word document, and then enlarged the Word document to see what was there. And during 2008, I made a series of discoveries that I finally summarized in December of that year. For example, I essentially literally fell out of my chair when I found several images of humanoids in different parts of the photograph. The two most significant, there's one spindly humanoid that would more closely resemble the gray extraterrestrials of the UFO contact literature on Earth. But of course on Mars they might not be extraterrestrials, they may literally be terrestrials that are indigenous to Mars.
Now Andy, real quick, where can our viewers actually see this and follow along as we're talking about this so they can see that picture?
Well, there's several sources. I can give them the original source. They can certainly simply Google PIA 10214 and then click on or upload the full resolution JPEG of the original NASA image in the NASA archive. But if they want to review and evaluate everything that I summarized for my 2008 discoveries in the Discovery of Life on Mars in December of last year, and then all the findings in 2009 that we're going to talk about tonight, I would urge them to visit the website of the Mars Anomaly Research Society, which is at www.projectmars.net, and then go down the sitemap on the left side of our homepage and click on the Annals of Mars, which is under the subheading that reads Research Papers. And that contains our first year of discoveries, not only my discoveries, but those made by our chief photo analyst, Ross Curley, and we're soon going to be reporting about the contributions of the British Mars anomalist, Paul Goodwin. And also there's a fellow lawyer of mine in Italy by the name of Antonio Di Bello, who has made some significant discoveries that we're going to be reporting on in 2010. But essentially, all of our 2009 findings are there under the Annals of Mars.
Excellent. Excellent.
And,
Okay. So,
so basically, I think I really realized that I was at the threshold of discovery when going up into the left field of that photograph on a ridge that NASA says is about 100 feet wide. It's called Tsiolkovsky Ridge. It was named for the Polish-born Russian rocketry pioneer Tsiolkovsky. And essentially near the center of the left side of that ridge is an artificial cluster of rocks. I say they're artificial because they've clearly been inserted into the ground there in a semicircle. And the rock on the right has a face on it similar to when we personify the sun as a being or face in our Earth civilization.
Mm-hmm.
That's clearly an artificial enclosure there of rock. And you can see a being with a bulbous head and a spindly body who has his back to the camera and is leaning over a rock ledge, apparently interacting with humanoids that are behind the rock enclosure. There's also, if you go over to the far right side of the image, there is a skull that I'm calling the grotesque humanoid skull. And there are a group of humanoids in front of that skull who are they look like they're recreating like we would at a campsite or at the beach. They're doing different random things that makes them look like they're playing or recreating at that location. And so when I found those two groups of humanoids, I was fairly astounded. I realized that that a breakthrough had occurred, and for some reason I had been given the cosmic privilege to possess the first set of two human eyes that was looking at life, indeed apparently intelligent humanoid life, on another planet, not just any other planet, but the planet Mars, which is the planet that every 2 years comes closest to our planet. And so that was really what compelled me throughout 2008 to study, literally spend about 1,000 hours scrutinizing PIA 10214 and then ultimately publishing my paper in December of last year. But since then, we've been busy and we've made a lot of breakthroughs, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight.
Excellent. Let's go ahead and start off in January of 2009 and where your research was taking you from that point forward.
Right. I really have to give credit to our organization and not only my own work, but the contributions made by Alfred Lambert Weber, the chairman of Mars, and again, Ross Curley, because if you look at let's say the 110-year history of intelligent discourse about the possibility that Mars is an inhabited planet, that stretches, let's say, from Schiaparelli's discoveries of his famous canali on Mars, in the Great Opposition of Mars in 1877. Actually, it wasn't 110 years. It's almost 125 years at this point, through the scrutiny that Mars received from researchers like Percival Lowell in the beginning of the 1900s, all the way up to the contributions made by our recent great Mars anomalists like Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra and Carl Munk. I would dare say that in the last year, Mars has made as many discoveries of what is actually on Mars as were made during those 125 years. And I know that's a tall glass of water to drink, but I think that as we go through these discoveries, we'll see that this was a very significant year. This past year of 2009 was an extremely significant year in the area of Mars discovery. So let's take a look at January. In January, I had written the paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, about PIA 10214, that single photograph. And so early in 2009, I turned my attention to a second NASA photograph. And in the same way, I had scrutinized 10214 because it contained, I thought it might be intelligent to investigate what surrounded the image of the statues up on the left side of the ledge there, of the cliff. I thought, well, okay, if this photograph depicts the western view of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin, why don't I turn 90 degrees and look what's on the south what's in the south, the southern reaches of the West Valley. And to my astonishment, in January of 2009, I found an area that looks like tilled soil. It looks like a site on Earth that we have around, let's say, agricultural sites, industrial sites, excavation areas, for example, where mining is going on, or where tubers or other plants are being planted in agricultural projects. But anyway, it's basically an area of tilled soil where there are rows of dark brown soil on the ground. And on the right side of that area of tilled soil is a structure that kind of looks like a ski lodge. To some of us, it looks like the head of a bear, of a brown bear, from the side. It almost looks, in fact, like the skin of a brown bear has been laid on the ground and then scoured. From the base of that head, or that head-like structure, is a pipe. And from that pipe, I found, to my astonishment, running fluid, presumably running water. It certainly looks like running water, or some other clear fluid like water. We can't say that it's water because we haven't sampled it yet. But it's clearly a viscous fluid that is gushing from this pipe. And it's falling, so we know that gravity obviously is on effect on Mars. It's falling into what looks like a catch basin or a public fountain. And with the technology that I have available to me, we can see that there are human beings standing around the basin. So this finding really, I think, distinguishes what the Mars Anomaly Research Society is doing relative to the data from Mars and what NASA is alleging that it's finding in its own data. Because at the time that I was publishing photographs and text showing this location where there was water, apparently water, some other fluid, falling from a pipe and falling into an intentional catch basin that humanoids were standing around, which is literally a situs of civilization, certainly rudimentary civilization, embodied in an aqueduct or viaduct of some kind. NASA was declaring that it had possibly found ice on Mars. And I think this really contrasts what's going on here. NASA is providing the data, but NASA is publicly releasing a set of de minimis discoveries in which it can incrementally nudge the public towards an ultimate understanding that Mars is an inhabited planet, that there are life forms and a rudimentary form of civilization on Mars. In fact, perhaps a much more advanced civilization underneath the surface of Mars for reasons I will describe later. But I realize at this point that inevitably, historically speaking, I was immersed in an essential antagonism between what I and the organization I founded has been able to find and tell others about what's on Mars and what our own space agency will admit. Now, I don't know why the space agency is taking the position that it is. It may be understaffed in terms of its photo analysis. I mean, there's always been a very technicist thrust to NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab. And so perhaps they're just interested in the technical feat of putting the rovers up there and then photographing and sending photographs back. But the significance of their photographs is that they contain evidence of the ecology and civilization of Mars. And so disclosing that to the public and conjecturing intelligently about the implications of that data is why I founded Mars. And so early here in January of '09, we were able to show our readers that there is running water on Mars, not just ice, as NASA would speculate. And so that we published the discovery of water on Mars, indeed running water falling not in a natural river or waterfall, but in a viaduct that had intentionally been placed there. We did in January of 2009.
That's incredible, Andy. That is incredible. Now, your work has also kind of progressed into, what was it, March of 2003. And you want to go into talking about the new animal species that you kind of found out about in March of 2009?
In 9, sure.
Yes.
Well, it was in March of this past year, that, okay, we had, I had published the discovery of life on Mars in December of 2008. It obviously made revolutionary claims, but from analyzing a single photograph. So it was my commitment at the time that I published my paper in December of last year that I would scrutinize at least one other photograph and see if I could find evidence of life of it. And to my astonishment, I found that in the next photograph that I scrutinized. I was very, very lucky. Of course, as I mentioned, I decided to take the NASA photograph, or at least one of the NASA photographs, that depicted what we could see from the southern purchase of the home plate plateau. And this was just literally just a guess, basically, because I thought, kind of conceived of myself of sort of sitting in the rover, and I thought, well, now I'll make a left turn and go south.
Mm-hmm.
So I got on the internet and I found image PIA 11049, which is literally the southern reaches of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin, as taken from the Spirit when the Spirit, you know, rode over, just traveled over to that edge of the plateau and took a series of photographs. Throughout the first half of 2008, in fact, January through June of 2008, it took a photo montage of the southern reaches of the West Valley. And I found 3 life forms that clearly are not statues. Okay, so these finds not only corroborated the notion of animal forms on Mars, but I think they proved that the animal forms I found in PIA 10214 were in fact life forms rather than statues. And the reason I say that is because of the coloration and the light patterns falling on these 3 creatures. So let me establish what these 3 creatures that we found in March of this past year are and how your listeners can find them.
Okay.
If you look at PIA 11049, if you scrutinize the front ranges of that photograph, let's say the bottom quarter center of the photograph, if you were to draw a band, 4 lines horizontally across the photograph, in the middle of that bottom quarter of the entire photograph, that strip, there's a rock, and then either on top of the rock or behind it, we think it's actually a little bit behind it, there's an animal form that looks like a cross between a monkey and a grasshopper. And because it seems to be hopping from rock to rock, I named it the rock hopper. And right in front of that creature, there are 2 little humanoids who are wedged under the boulder, as if basically hiding from what looks like a predatory species on the surface of Mars. If you then go to the upper right reaches of the photograph of PIA 11049, there's a creature walking away from the camera, away from the rover Spirit, that looks like a cross between a bear and a cat. Some people see in it the structure of like a seal or a sea lion. I named it the Martian bear cat because from the position that the rover Spirit is in, we really can't tell whether it's a bear or just a very large feline animal.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason that I'm convinced it's a life form and not a statue is you can see the sun shining off the fur of the creature, just like the famous Patterson-Gimlin footage of the Sasquatch that was photographed in Northern California in 1967.
Okay.
You can see that the brown fur of this creature is sort of glistening in the sun. In fact, the clumps of fur on different parts of its body represent sort of patches of sunlight that you can see glistening on sort of a chocolate brown fur. And then also, if you identify the patch of tilled soil where I mentioned that you can see the pipe of falling water, there's a little Sasquatch species, a new primate species of some kind, sitting on the hillside that I'm calling the Sendak. I named it for the famous author and illustrator Maurice Sendak, who wrote the award-winning children's classic Where the Wild Things Are.
Okay.
Because this primate essentially is almost identical to the primate on the famous cover of that book. It doesn't have horns. It may have horns, but it's just a very chubby sort of primate, very close in form to the different Sasquatch and Yeti and Yeren sightings that have been seen around the world. And it's just sitting there. And like the Martian bear cat up in the right corner, you can see the sun glistening off its fur. And so, again, while some of the objects in 10214 that I think are humanoids or animals may in fact be statues, there's more of a dynamism in 11049, I think because they spent 6 months photographing the whole scene. And the objects are illuminated with greater clarity. And so this was essentially important corroborating evidence about 3 months after I published my paper and basically staked my professional reputation on my conclusion that Mars was inhabited. That's not the only photograph to show animal life forms. Here was a second one, in fact, in an area literally geographically adjacent to the first area that was photographed. And so I think that's significant.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the following month, you actually found new evidence of a reptoid humanoid. Can you go into that for us for the month of April?
Yes, in fact, this was something that I touched on in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, but I really didn't have the time under the time constraints of 2008 and the 3 weeks of hibernation that I went to in December of '08. I mean, I was sleeping only about 3 hours a night.
Oh, my.
For almost a month. I was stuck in a blizzard here in the Northwest, and I pretty much hunkered down in December to knock out the paper. And I did find disturbing data. In fact, there's a section of the original paper entitled Disturbing Data. But in the next months, that next 3 or 4 months after I wrote the paper, I was able to scrutinize what's going on in 10.2.14. And it presents essentially a profound mystery. I mean, on the one hand, 10.2.14 shows life on Mars, embodied in the humanoids that I described, but there's also disturbing evidence of death on Mars contained in 10.2.14. So I was eager to scrutinize another photograph to try to corroborate that data. If we go back to 10.2.14, we find that the statue of the little lady in the blue dress with her male companion having broken off and slid down to the right side of the cliff there. I published a paper in spring of '09 showing that the beings on the edge are not only a statue, that's the name I gave to that statuary complex. She was being called Little Bigfoot, which I thought was completely disinformational in its thrust. It was a way of making a mockery of the data, essentially. So I call them the beings on the edge with the same elegant simplicity that we speak of the face of Mars at Cydonia, just a functional, descriptive title.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found is that those elements of the statue are standing atop a very large rock carving of a plumed serpent, or that's to say, something that looks like the head of a snake or a reptile, that has a mane like a horse, that's limping across the statue and biting the neck of a bearded male human figure that's looking forward. And then between the male head and this plumed serpent, there's more of a sort of a Homer Simpson-looking sort of reptilian humanoid face looking forward. It may be the soul of the humanoid as it transitions out of its body as it's being bitten on the neck. And then when I scrutinized the ravine to the immediate western edge of the home plate plateau, I found clear and convincing evidence of hundreds of humanoid bodies and even several serpent-like reptiles slithering across this deposition field of hundreds of humanoid bodies. And so even back when I wrote The Discovery of Life on Mars in 2008, I was concerned about the fact that there was this evidence of death on planet Mars. Now, I used it in my paper to show, well, if there's dead bodies on Mars, they were once alive. And so that's an inferential way of establishing life on Mars, that is to say, via corpses on Mars. But during the beginning of 2009, I began to scrutinize about what this data could mean. And I think there are really 3 possible explanations. One is it may be an above-ground cemetery of the primarily underground civilization on Mars, because such a civilization would have an interest in placing its deceased on the surface where they could desiccate, which would keep the underground civilization hygienic, or keep it sanitary. So there's certainly a mundane explanation for this data. But if the data is not mundane in nature, there are 2 basically very unpleasant possibilities for us to consider. One might be that these bodies in the ravine right past the home plate plateau represent a place where reptilian predators have taken their humanoid prey and done so in mass numbers. For example, some snake species will bring prey back to their lair like that. A far more hideous possibility, of course, is that if we examine the statue with the reptile biting the neck of a human, and then right beyond that, down the cliff in the ravine, we find these hundreds of humanoid bodies, the whole scene could depict something that I don't think we would ever have believed that we would have or expected to find on Mars, which is that this may be a location of human sacrifice, of ritual sacrifice of humans, and their mass internment. And this, of course, implies that there may be some sort of oppressive reptoid civilization on Mars. But I hazard to conjecture explanations that are as disquieting as that, because in point of fact, all we know is that there's this strange statue and then some kind of deposition field of what look like corpses of humanoids that literally litter the ravine beyond the home plate plateau. If this does represent any of those possibilities, I mean predation or simply a funereal site where an open-air cemetery is being maintained, or something far more tyrannical, far more fascistic in its implications, literally an area of mass human sacrifice, that really places us in a moral and a scientific and a philosophical dilemma. We're going to have to ask ourselves as we begin to go to Mars in greater numbers than we already have, because as you know, I'm disclosing the fact that not only have human explorers been to Mars, but I myself visited Mars several times in 1981 in a secret space program being maintained by the U.S. government. But even if we were to assume arguendo that those visitations haven't taken place, the conventional history of Mars is that American and Russian and joint Russo-American and Russo-Sino missions to Mars, that is to say joint ventures between the United States and Russia and between China and Russia, are actively being planned as we speak. Mm-hmm. And so as we begin to have greater contact with the ecology and civilization of Mars, I think this issue of reptoid human predation is going to basically present us with a kind of a Hobson's choice between upholding the precautionary principle regarding the ecology of Mars and honoring the prime directive in terms of not interfering with its civilization versus what earlier concepts in the law would urge us to do. I'm speaking, of course, of those use cogens norms on Earth that outlaw things like slavery and genocide. Because if the humanoids on Mars are being oppressed and, in fact, murdered in mass numbers, as this data may show, then we're going to be compelled probably to intervene on Mars and upset the natural balance there and do so in furtherance of the human rights of those life forms that are being subjected to genocide there. So I think that what's in 10.2.14 is extremely profound in terms of its legal and policy implications, especially now that the major spacefaring nations are launching missions to Mars. And so I'm calling for an international panel of experts to be formed among the major spacefaring nations, simply to sit down together with this photograph and determine what's there as part of their planning for their missions. But I was able in April of 2009 to find a second photograph of a detail that I found in 10.2.14. In 10.2.14, I found an image of a reptile creature that looks like essentially like a turtle without a shell, that's sitting with different tentacles coming in and out of the soil, sort of coming up from the soil, and holding the body of a reptoid, of a humanoid that it has bitten in half. And there's the lower torso, the lower extremities of another humanoid sitting next to it. In 11.049, in the back of the scene, towards the far southern reaches of the West Valley, I was able to isolate a detail of another type of reptoid sitting in front of the corpse of a humanoid dressed in the same blue clothing as the bodies we find littering the ravine beyond the home plate plateau. So in April, basically, while spring was flourishing here in the Northwest, I was confronting some very dark hours as I was realizing that I had found another NASA photograph that establishes that there's reptoid predation of humanoids on the surface of Mars.
Absolutely. My goodness, Andy. Geez, where to begin next? I have so many questions that I want to interject, but I really want you to keep on going through the chronology of your discoveries here. So I'm going to hold off on my questions until the second hour. Let's go ahead and go to June of 2009. And this is where you actually done your first interview with Jessica Mystic. And why don't you go ahead and take us from that point forward?
Well, yeah, something very important happened in June of 2009, and the catalyst for it was a young 27-year-old crystal child named Jessica Shaw, who hosts a program called Jessica Mystic, and also goes by that name.
Okay.
And Jessica had been asking me for several months to really sit down with her and sort of synthesize the hidden history of my Mars discovery. And this was also responsive to the entreaties of another strategic ally of mine from Vancouver, BC, the illustrious Alfred Lambermont Weber, the chairman of Mars. Alfred and I had many discussions in 2008 and into 2009 about whether I should wage a partial disclosure campaign related to Mars using the natural history data that I was finding in NASA and ESA's photographs, or whether I should essentially wage a truth campaign, that is a disclosure campaign that would give the full truth of my experience in time travel as a child attached to DARPA's Project Pegasus in the early 1970s, and also go into some of the hidden history of my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. And so at Jessica's insistence as well, I decided to sit down with her, indeed for almost 7 hours in the summer of 2009. And we ended up taping a set of interviews that has become a YouTube classic, as it were. And I continue to get inquiries from members of the general public about that interview. It was really something that people really enjoyed and found meaning in, and that gives me great pleasure as a writer and as a public figure, knowing that that particular interview really reached people in a special way. And what we did in that interview is I went through essentially the 40-year history of the hidden history of my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. There, in fact, were 7 times between 1968, when I was a 7-year-old, and 2008, when I was a 47-year-old and published my paper, that the Central Intelligence Agency had shared data with me, essentially so that they would try to guarantee historically that I would play the role relative to the discovery of life on Mars that I have. Now, they weren't giving me the paper that I wrote. They were, that is to say, they weren't responsible for the data. They were sharing with me my data from the future, because it was around the time period, 1967-68, that the U.S. government achieved quantum access to past and future events. So among the things they knew is that I was a person of interest, because 40 years hence, I would be publicly associated with the discovery of life on Mars as a result of my own original analysis of what's in these images. And so among those 7 data points I shared in that set of interviews, I tried to essentially synthesize the way in which the hidden history of U.S. time travel research and development and the later discovery of life on Mars sort of correlated. So, for example, I described how in 1969, my father, at our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, my dad was an engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, but he had reporting requirements for the CIA because he was essentially the $1 a year man in the area of teleportation, the theory and practice of teleportation. And he was one of the project engineers on Project Pegasus, which was the DARPA program that was researching and developing different forms of quantum access in the late 60s and early 70s. Everything from conventional remote viewing by gifted psychics all the way to physical time travel to the future, virtual time travel to the past and future via chronovision, and so on. And so one of the things that the CIA decided to do is they passed along my photograph of the humanoid being that I found on Tsiolkovsky Ridge and placed in my paper. And my dad showed me that picture in 1969. And we had a little colloquy where he said, "You know what this is?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "It's an image of a Martian." And I said, "It is?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's a humanoid being on Mars." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "You know who finds it?" And he didn't say who found it. He said, "You know who finds it?" And I said, "Who?" And he said, "You do." And so now I've given you a look at it, and now I'm going to put it back in the envelope. And he put it back in the manila envelope with the red wax seal and tied up the tie string and everything. So this was essentially data from 40 years in the future that the CIA passed along to my father as an engineer that was consulted on different classified projects, indeed was attached to several of those projects, so that I would have the opportunity in childhood to get sort of an unconscious understanding of what my future destiny was relative to Mars. And so this is really fraught with profound implications. It indicates that faction of a highly compartmentalized intelligence community that my father was part of knew that Mars was inhabited in the late 1960s. Indeed, I believe that was the early summer of '69. That was even before the lunar landing. The second thing I talked about, or one of the data points I talked about with Jessica, was the fact that in 1970, my father urged me to jump into the car with him, and he took me over to the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, where the teleport was located, where we were jumping back to New Mexico as part of Project Pegasus. But on this particular weekend, when I got in the car and I asked him whether we were going to be teleporting to Santa Fe again, he said, no, there are a couple Martians over at Curtiss Wright, and they want to meet you. Apparently what had happened is our aerospace personnel, including my dad, who had worked on the ramjet at Curtiss Wright, for example, the ramjet engine, one of the first high-performance jet engines, and other classified aerospace projects in New Jersey, had been in liaison with the intelligent humanoids on Mars. And so let me make it clear that there are intelligent humanoids on Mars that virtually resemble us. They look a little bit cruder looking than humans. They're a little bit sort of uglier looking than us. In other words, the men are a little bit more masculine looking. You know, they look a little bit more like Telly Savalas than Cary Grant. Okay? So they're usually bald, but when you're interacting with them, you sense that you're interacting with fellow human beings. And we went into a brief meeting that was ending there. We didn't enter the Building 68 where the teleport was. We entered a much larger hangar there at Curtiss Wright, a much larger building. And there was a silver craft that was puttering over beyond this loading dock-like stage as we entered the hangar. And we went off over to a suite of offices over on the left side. And there was a discussion going on among several U.S. aerospace engineers like my dad with their pen holders and their security badges attached to their left shirt pocket. And these three Martian humanoids that were wearing tightly fitting silver spacesuits with a blood red five-sided crest on their chest with a yellow lightning bolt in it. And they were speaking in very high-pitched tones of voice, which was very disconcerting for me to be in on as an 8-year-old going on 9, because these, I could tell they were human, but they were dressed funny and they sounded funny, and they were just talking shop. And then they got up and left, and they walked. My dad and I walked out first, and they walked past us to their ship. And the third Martian to walk past me turned to my father and said, "Well, it was a pleasure visiting your beautiful planet again, Ray, and a privilege to see you again. Thank you for introducing us to your young son, Andrew." Now, they didn't say anything to me, but they clearly wanted to meet me. So I think what happened was that our aerospace engineers, including my dad, had informed them that as a result of our quantum access activities, they had identified me as the discoverer of life on their planet, at least the public disclosure of life on their planet. Because, of course, our aerospace community had already discovered life on Mars. Indeed, we were already in liaison with the humanoid civilization on Mars. But they just wanted to meet me because they knew that I had a special destiny relative to their, the ecology and civilization of their home planet. And my father mentioned a couple things about the Martians after they left and we were driving home. A couple of the things I remember is he explained that their voices were high-pitched simply because there was more oxygen in our atmosphere. And their vocal cords and lungs were adjusted to breathing and speaking in an atmosphere that has some oxygen on it that results from oxygen leaching out of the lithosphere, the rocks on Mars. But just like when we breathe helium and try to talk, their vocal cords are strained by the different different composition of the gases in our atmosphere. And he made some strange comments about their behavior or their worldview. One thing I remember that he stated is, we've taken them out into the woods around Curtiss Wright, and one time when I was on one of those field trips, they found a clump of leaves from different tree species that were attached to each other with a little bit of moisture on the floor of the woods. And they spent about a half hour talking about it. And I always wondered why they would have done so. You'd think if they were intelligent enough to reach our planet, they wouldn't scrutinize a couple of leaves out in the woods for such a long period of time. He also said that he had been asked, because my dad was a brilliant mathematician. He was a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh. But most of what he did in the 8 years that he spent employed by the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, which was a high-end Defense Department think tank during that era, was solve complex mathematical problems in the invention of those electronic components that most of them were later bought up by Robert Noyce of Intel Corporation and became sort of the hardware of the personal computer revolution. So my dad was actually one of the mathematician engineers that was solving a lot of those problems of how those different solenoids and so forth would operate inside of the early computer equipment. So he was a brilliant mathematician. They've shown me their math, and I just don't get it. Because when I work with their notational system, 2 plus 2 equals 5. And remember, that was a strange remark. And I thought about why those two things would have been true. Excuse me. And one thing I realized is the Martians are living in essentially a desert planet that's almost devoid of vegetation. So just like the Aborigines in Australia on our planet, they would have a keen ability to analyze data from the natural environment because the very survival of their human civilization would depend on that degree of sensitivity for environmental data. So that's why I think they were scrutinizing the leaves for, as my dad said, for a half hour.
Mm-hmm.
And then if 2 plus 2 would have to equal 5 in an underground civilization because 4 posts hold up a fifth element, which is a roof, right, or the top of a mining shaft, or some other passageway under a substantial amount of rock. So perhaps in the derivation of their underground civilization, I'm surmising that 2 plus 2 better equal 5, or you're not going to hold your roof up. Tons of rock are going to fall on your head. So those were two of the strange comments that he made about the Martians. He also wondered how they could stand, 3 guys could stand occupying such a tiny spacecraft for 24 hours, he said, which was the time it took to get back to Mars. So I still have to do the math to figure out how fast their ship was going. Maybe one of your listeners can do that calculation for me. Divide the distance of Mars or the average distance to Mars by 24 hours and see how fast that ship was opening up. But when it took off from the tarmac there at Curtis Wright, it just zoomed off almost at a 45-degree angle. It was amazing.
Okay.
And then the other thing I talked about was that in 1971, I was recovering from the kind of respiratory illness that's been bedeviling me this fall here that caused the postponement of our show. I had kind of bronchitis coming out of the Halloween period there in 71. And as I was recuperating, my dad came into the guest bedroom there at our house, which we always used as the sick room. I was the youngest of a family of 5 kids, so my mom would always stick somebody with an illness in that room. My dad came into the guest bedroom there and closed the door and said, "Son, I have something very important to show you. I want you to read it." And I said, "Okay, Dad, what is it?" And he pulled my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, out of one of these envelopes with the red wax seal on. And he said, "Take a look at this." And he handed me the paper. And it was my 2008 paper, I now realize. In fact, same type font and everything that's on the PDF version at our website, projectmars.net. I looked at it and it said The Discovery of Life on Mars. And then he said, "Take a look at the copyright designation." And it said, "Copyright 2008 by Andrew D. BASIAGO." And I said, "Why would it have D? Why would it have D in my name, Dad?" And he said, "Well, that's apparently the initial of the confirmation name that you're going to be selecting, which was Daniel. And yet I didn't have that name as a 10-year-old. And he said, look at the year you publish it." And I said, 2008. He said, "How old are you going to be in 2008? And I quickly said, 47. And he goes, "Right, you published this when you're 47, and it's a very significant work." So the purpose of this exercise, son, is we want you to read this paper and scrutinize the text, scrutinize the photographs, read the captions, think about how the captions relate to the photographs and the text. And the purpose of this exercise is to remember as much of this paper as you can. And I said, "Why is that, Dad? Why do I have to read this paper at all?" And he said, "Because when you write it, we want you to include as much data about Mars as possible." Okay, so this is the strange way that the CIA has been using quantum access to engage in this practice that I call quantum enfoldment. It was the consensus that they wouldn't use data from the future, data about future events, to play God and prevent negative events from happening. But where there were positive events, they have been engaging at the threshold by approaching persons of interest like myself and then giving them an awareness of what their future is going to contain so they can maximize the potential of the unfoldment of future events that are positive. So I described in my recent appearance on Coast to Coast AM on November 11th how they've been doing this by approaching future American presidents decades in advance of their presidencies and apprising them of their destinies as president so they can psychologically adjust to what their futures hold, which is obviously the crushing responsibilities of being President of the United States and leader of the free world. In my case, they were aware of the publication of my paper, Discovery of Life on Mars, and its significance in science and in social affairs because they were in possession of the paper. And in this case, I was permitted to read the paper and try to remember as much of it as possible. One of the other 7 data points that I shared with Jessica Mystic was that in 1981, when I was 19, for reasons that we don't know, quite frankly, but apparently because I had been involved in teleportation as a child attached to Project Pegasus, I was invited by an officer of the CIA by the name of Courtney M. Hunt, who they kind of placed in my life in 1981 to sort of bring me up to speed on different things that the CIA did and was involved in and how it functioned. Because as a child trainee on Pegasus, you know, DARPA had reporting requirements to the CIA. It was ultimately an intelligence gathering project. And so I was being tracked by CIA. And so in 1981, I was introduced to Mr. Hunt. And throughout the early part of summer of 1981, June timeframe, he asked me repeatedly, so do you want to go to Mars? And I really didn't want to go. But finally, in July of 81, I said, why do I have to go? And he said, human survival on Earth depends on it. So he said, I just want you to think about that. And I thought about the possibilities of going to Mars and perishing there, or going to Mars and being stranded there and having to fend for myself in a difficult environment. And I finally thought, well, you know, if I don't go, my species might not survive on Earth, so I better go. And I thought back to things my father had said to us when we were attached to Pegasus. When I asked him, you know, well, why are we involved in this, even if we may lose our life? He said, well, you know, people have to be willing to risk their lives for human civilization to advance, even if it was something as simple as migrating across a river, you know, putting their children on their shoulders and walking across a river, you know, to escape an erupting volcano or to find more fertile hunting grounds or farmlands or something. Human beings have to take environmental risks so that all of humanity can survive. And so I made the decision there to comply with Courtney Hunt's request. And in July and then again in August of 1981, he drove me over to a building that was a CIA facility over in El Segundo, California, near where Grumman and some of those other defense contractors are in El Segundo. We went up an elevator, walked out on about the 5th floor, and then Courtney had me walk back into the elevator. The elevator went up about another 3 flights to the 8th floor, and from there, the elevator became a jump room that basically took me to Mars in about 20 minutes, morphing into more of a cylindrical form about halfway through the 20-minute trip. Now, I'm disclosing this now because, look, this is the truth of my own experience, and if human civilization is going to advance, people like myself who have been involved in the secret activities of the U.S. defense community have to begin to step forward and begin to make the public aware of what the U.S. government has secretly achieved. Because in the same way that I'm rolling out the natural history findings I'm making about Mars, not only do human beings on Earth have, I believe, a natural right, a human right to the natural history of the true, a true telling of the natural history of the universe, of the solar system that we inhabit. The fact, for example, that Mars is also an inhabited planet. But I think that individuals also have a human right to a true telling of the history of science and applied science in our time, and that we shouldn't develop a cult of intelligence that keeps these technical secrets from the rest of humanity. So at risk of ridicule and of hostility and contempt, of public embarrassment, I've decided to come forward and reveal the truth, which is I teleported to Mars and back twice in 1981, and that I can corroborate claims made by such researchers as the talented David Wilcock that, David has claimed that there are 600,000 human personnel on Mars. I can't corroborate that, but I can certainly corroborate his claim that there's a secret space program that has placed human personnel on Mars. And so it was in that interview with a young Christian child a beautiful 27-year-old woman, Jessica Mystic, that I decided to come forward and make those revelations.
Okay, Andy, we're at the top of the hour, and what I'd love to do is give you a 7-minute break to get a... And we're back on Otherworld Radio. This is your host, Sandra Sabatini, and we're talking with Andrew D. Basiago. Now, before we left, we were getting ready to talk with Andy about the new Cydonia. But we actually have a caller that would really love to talk to Andy and has been waiting very, very patiently. And I'd love to bring the caller on right now. Andy, would that be okay?
Yeah, let's find out who it is.
Okay. Caller from area code 570, please state your name and where you're calling in from.
How you doing? This is my name's Renato. I'm calling from Pennsylvania.
Okay, Renato, you have a question for Andy?
Yes. I just wanted to know. I didn't catch the whole interview, so I just want to know if he's aware of the two Mars Records books.
No, I'm not. I'm starting to compile a library for our organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society. So, if you could give me, if you could forward some information about those to my email address, which is president.mars@gmail.com, I'd certainly like to take a look at them.
Sure. Well, the website's really easy. It's just called themarsrecords.com, and basically, what you describe as the jump point, they describe the different types of animals and humanoid beings that you describe.
Really?
There's quite a bit of corroboration. They say that they have, the secret government has their own base there, I guess you could say, and that they're actually doing, lab work there, and a lot of crazy, not crazy to me, but crazy to the average person. And I think... I'm sorry?
Is this the account of Michael Rell?
To be honest with you, I do not remember their name.
I was contacted a number of years ago by Michael Rell, and yet I didn't read his work. I just had about an hour phone conversation with him, as I recall. When I was beginning to focus on my memories of Project Pegasus, which for me was pretty much going back and writing down what had occurred to me in childhood. I was kind of ignoring what had happened to me in my late teens and early 20s. And I think I may have had a conversation with Michael Rell, but I didn't reveal to him during those discussions that I myself had been to Mars in 1981. So if these are the works of Michael Rell, then I can say I heard of the works, but I never went on and read them. But it doesn't surprise me. Sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you up, but that's actually a good thing, because if you read the two books, it just shows the name Pat, but basically, like I said, a lot of the stuff you're saying, they also said in these two books, but they're using something called a biofeedback meter and clearing sessions. And this guy said he was in the military, and they sent him there, and he has a couple of crazy accounts that that he went underground into their I guess area where they live.
Now, caller, do you have a specific question for Mr. Basiago?
That was it. I just wanted to know if he was aware of the Mars Records.
Okay.
Thanks, caller. Well, yes, caller. I would say I'm aware of the books, but I never read them. I think I had about an hour phone conversation with Michael Rell a number of years ago, but they were certainly many years after I had been up there. I mean, I think our conversation may have taken place around the 2000-2001 time frame, which was already about 20 years after I had been up there in 1981 as a 19-year-old. So I'm familiar with Michael's work, but I've never read his books, and I have to. I can also say that my experiences up there corroborated what I've now am finding in NASA's photographs. So I think we're getting evidence now from different areas, different kinds of evidence. And I would also remind your listeners, Sandy, that personal experience is direct evidence. There's a belief in society that personal experience that's difficult to believe is hearsay. But in fact, when you directly see and experience things. In any courtroom in this country, you can testify about such things that you saw or did, and the court treats it as direct evidence. And so that's why I'm now sharing my memories of my direct experience on Mars, because it's highly relevant to this whole discussion of what's up there.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. We have a question actually coming from the chat room right now from Mad Hatter. He says, I wonder if Andy knows what type of social life or what type of government, if it's called that, on Mars. Is there a government or is there any type of social structure that you know of, Andy?
Well, this is a difficult question. I mean, we can only infer what that governmental structure is. I have no knowledge of what the governmental structure on Mars is, but we know it has to be sophisticated enough for that government, that civilization, to have sent astronauts to our civilization by 1970. We know also that there has to be enough social cohesion, enough social regimentation for different types of humanoids on Mars to be wearing identical clothing. We have the example of the 3 Martian astronauts wearing the silver spacesuits. And then we have the example of the blue dresses and the white shirts and blue pants that we see on the humanoid bodies in PIA 10214. So while it's been alleged that the civilization there is 150 years more advanced than us, all that I can testify to is the fact that it was more advanced than us enough to reach us by 1970, and that there's clearly some form of organized social structure in place, because what would have to be for the humanoid civilization on Mars to become a spacefaring civilization, and also for the humanoid life forms there to be cooperating enough to be wearing identical clothing. But I know nothing about literally the political philosophy or structure of the Martian government itself.
Okay, Andy, we got another question coming out of our Other World Radio Gmail blast here. It says from John B. from Somerset, Massachusetts. Great show. What can the layperson do to help with disclosure, Andy?
Well, first of all, we all have an influence on other people's thinking. I mean, since I began appearing on the radio, I've gotten 1,000 words of affirmation from messages of affirmation from members of the general public. So I think, first of all, none of us should underestimate the impact that the unself-censoring expression of our own beliefs have on other people. So the first thing we can do is not be apologetic and to be bold about what we believe to be the true nature of the universe that we're living in. I've been receiving messages, words of support and encouragement from people for about a year now that in several cases have literally brought me to tears. And so the first thing we have to remember is that our beliefs matter and that we should communicate what we believe to be the truth to the best of our ability with our fellow human beings, because it matters. It creates the nature of the civilization that we live in. The second thing we need to do is share that critical information with others. I'm trying to do that through my websites, ProjectMars.net and ProjectPegasus.net, and appearances like this on radio. We also have to begin to pressure our legislators to basically support a pro-disclosure agenda. And I'm personally going to be approaching the President and members of the Senate about these issues, about the fact that the people of the United States and the world deserve to be told the truth about the fact that Mars is inhabited, that the people of the United States and the world deserve to be told the truth that the U.S. government achieved quantum access over 40 years ago. And so the third component has to be supporting the disclosure movement so that it becomes as powerful a movement as the abolition movement was. The analogy that I'm framing is that the abolition movement quite clearly was directed at bringing about an end to physical slavery, to the physical oppression of human beings. And I think in a similar way, the disclosure movement can and will become a mass movement that will bring an end to metaphysical slavery, to the metaphysical oppression that's embodied in the fact that the U.S. government has decided to treat all of us as cosmic kindergartners and not as cosmic citizens. I believe that people are ready for the truth, and I believe that they're ready for cosmic citizenship. And that will only be achieved when the democratic or allegedly democratic governments on this planet begin to bring everybody on the planet into the truth of what they know about the true nature of the universe. And so that's why I think, people say, well, Mars is all the way out there. What about issues like healthcare and hunger and so forth on Earth? All of those are valid issues that we have to focus on. But in broader terms, after we feed and house and clothe and educate everybody, we're also building a civilization that's going to be going somewhere. And the place it's going to be going is into outer space. And we can't continue to keep the truth about our findings in outer space back from most of the human beings on Earth. So we have to pressure the U.S. government to become a disclosure-oriented government, and also pressure President Obama and hold his feet to the fire in the sense that if he's going to be a president who's going to embody positive change, change begins with the truth. And so the disclosure aspect of the disclosure movement has to become part of his agenda for change. And that's where I think we're going to achieve this. But, we're living really in a different world now that's linked by the World Wide Web, because in the final analysis, we don't need to rely on the government to frame our understanding of the universe. We're now living in more of an open society where people can talk about their findings, and we don't need our elected officials to lead us towards what they have concluded the truth is. We can arrive at our understanding of the truth independently if we possess the courage to do so.
Okay, Andy, the second part of his question, John's question, is what can we do to get you onto, I guess, national television, get you on an interview? How would they go about by, I guess, trying to get you on public television to disclose some of your information?
Well, I think that's inevitably going to emerge during 2010. That's something we can look forward to prospectively over the next year. But essentially, mass media in the United States is produced by producers. So find out who the producer is of a particular program on television, and write them a letter asking that I be invited on as a guest. I mean, that's how I got on Coast to Coast AM. I was invited on as a result of public acclaim by individuals who primarily had listened to the interview by Jessica, and also some of my other radio interviews.
Okay.
So write the producers of TV shows, and I'd be happy to come on.
Excellent, Andy. Now, another question that we have out of the chat section here. One of let's see here. One of the people here wanted to know is, out of your experiences, does this correlate anything with the movie Total Recall? Is it your experiences very much like that movie?
I haven't seen that film, so I really can't comment. I can say that I was never subjected to anything more than brainwashing after I left Project Pegasus. So, for example, my recollection of going to Mars as a 19-year-old was a memory that was certainly pushed back to the back of my mind simply by the stress that it produced as an event. But my case is not a case of recovered memory. I never forgot what I did as a time traveler, as a child participant in Project Pegasus, and I certainly never forgot my 2 brief trips up to Mars as a 19-year-old. But, memory, I would urge anybody to try to write their own autobiography. It's a very complex process. There is no center to our mind. Our memories are stored in a set of constellations of neural networks throughout the brain. And I think the process of writing a memoir about my experiences in Project Pegasus caused a number of memories to surface that I hadn't had access to for years. So I think the real line drawing for me was between what the conventional life that I've lived, but then revisiting both the awe-inspiring and terrifying aspects of the non-ordinary or unconventional things that I've done. Just like any person who's experienced profoundly trying experiences, they're not memories that you tend to revisit every day. So, for example, the analogy here would be, let's say, to a child who was in wartime or a 19-year-old who was in combat. I think my experiences are very similar to those. Certainly people who served during the Vietnam War can relate to the fact that if you're dealing with the post-traumatic stress of very frightening experiences, then you don't tend to revisit those memories every day, and it takes quite an exertion of your will to write down what happened, and that's what I've been trying to do.
Okay, Andy. Before we left for our break, we were going to talk about New Cydonia, and let's get back to that, and let's finish up in the order that we were talking before we had to go on our break. Let's start in July of 2009.
Okay, well, actually, you're using a term of art that I've contributed to the discussion of what's on Mars. I called this site the New Cydonia. Basically, let me give you some of the history of this discovery. I was scrutinizing a photograph that was taken by the Mars Orbiter Express of the European Space Agency on January 15th of 2004. This is a satellite image. It was taken about 170 miles above the surface of Mars, and it created a large aerial display of a dry river channel called the Rule Vallis, which is kind of like a linear valley on Mars that had been formed by running water. And as I began to study this photograph, which is really a beautiful image, it had some incredible browns and blues in it, I realized that this was a dry riverbed, or primarily dry riverbed, in which major landforms had been carved primarily into the profiles of beings. One is sort of a diamond-shaped island, and on the eastern side of that island, the Martian civilization carved the profile of a man with his eyes closed that I'm calling the dreaming man. So imagine an island in a river channel, and they did a major terraforming of the eastern side of the island, and it's the right profile of a human face. And what I found so striking about that particular detail is it's very similar to the image of Pakal the Great, who is the Mayan king that is featured on the famous funereal lid, or sarcophagus lid, that is, that was found in Palenque, Mexico, that Eric von Daniken speculated in his book Chariots of the Gods in 1968 was in fact a Mayan operating the controls of a spaceship. This profile looks like it was carved by the same artist. It's so close to the famous lid from Palenque. And there are other faces. There's a face very similar to a Mayan with a plumed regalia coming from a headdress that's in the channel that you can see. There's the left side profile of a bearded pharaoh figure. There again we find the linkage to the ancient Egyptian civilization on Earth. There is a irregular shaped hill that looks very similar to the D&M pyramid found at Cydonia. In fact, this was one of the reasons that I named this site the New Cydonia, because I realized it was both different and similar, but like Cydonia had some massive landforms that were artificial. And so we called that sort of irregular pyramidal-shaped hill the D&M2 pyramid. There's also a set of primate faces. One resembles an orangutan, the other a gorilla, the other a sort of a Sasquatch face with very deep-set eyes. Across the river channel from the Dreaming Man, there are several cartoonish faces that we can see almost in full view. One looks sort of like a human scientist, like an Albert Einstein figure with a mustache, looking forward, who's positioned right next to a kind of a brooding gorilla head, maybe discussing the descent of intelligence in primates. Then there's a large mesa in which the Martians made the face of a dog almost as a hologram. So there's this tan-colored mesa with what looks like the face of a Saint Bernard somehow being illuminated up from the top of the mesa. Now, if that's a carving, it almost looks like it was carved with lasers or something. And then I found something very interesting in July and August of this year in the Rule Vallis, in this photograph, is there are about a dozen irregularly shaped circles that are very similar to craters. Now, we know craters are formed by objects that smash into a planet and create a natural circular pattern in the soil there. But these circular forms on Mars are excuse me, are irregularly shaped, and there are cartoonish heads and faces that have been carved in the center of them. Now, I have no idea what these are. They may be tokens or talismans of some kind. Somebody who wrote me, and after reading this paper, I very much recommend this paper. It's one of the papers from last year that I'm most proud of because it really illuminates Mars with the greatest depth. I'm really excited by the fact that in this 21st century that we now find ourselves in, human civilization on Earth is going to be experiencing something we really haven't experienced for about 500 years, which is literally the discovery of a new world. But it's not the Americas, it's what's on Mars. And so my paper, Ancient Terraforms Found in the Rule Vallis of Mars, I think is going to be one of literally hundreds over the course of the next century, thousands probably, that will illustrate and analyze some of these fascinating archaeological ruins that we see on the surface of Mars. So here we have a situation where we know that they're carving landforms that look like craters, but they have faces in them. So somebody wrote me and said, you know something? I bet they made these craters to collect water, and the faces are kind of the brand that is left by the owner of the crater. So, don't take water from my crater. That's my cistern. So who knows? They may just be previous Martians or the Martians that are on the surface today, just enjoying being artists on the surface. But one thing that's remarkable about Mars is, when humans on Earth make monuments, or certainly when modern humans carve things like Mount Rushmore, there's all sorts of review committees, and there's sort of this civilized kind of look to the artwork. The Martians are much more spontaneous with what they carve on the surface. It's almost like they allow some of their advanced graduate students in art to go out there and turn the side of an island into the shape of a face or something. They terraform their environment with a degree of subtlety and sophistication as artists that's extremely spontaneous and really profound in terms of sort of the natural flow of the creativity, which is what I'm really struck by. I mean, many of these works look virtually spontaneous. Some of them are very crude, but some of them are exquisitely beautiful, and yet very spontaneous and freehand, so to speak, in the way that they're articulated as artworks. So those are some of the things that we found in the Rule Vallis. Oh, by the way, there's one other major form there that I shouldn't neglect, which is there's the leftward profile of a barking dog or goat. Some people see it as some kind of reptilian figure. And then on his neck is one of these orb craters with what we originally thought was the face of a gray alien with a big lenticular eye. But in fact, that what we thought was the eye was actually the mouth of a beaked creature, sort of the right side of the mouth. And so there's this beaked creature, almost looks like a laughing bird, that's in that orb crater on the neck of the barking dog. So I would strongly urge your listeners to log on to projectmars.net and read my paper, Ancient Terraforms Found in the Rule Vallis of Mars, just to get a sense of the originality and just the incredible spontaneity of the art forms that we've already now found on Mars and that we're going to be exploring during the 21st century. And I think the significance of this find, and that's why I call this area the New Cydonia, is it essentially proves the proposition made by researchers like Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra and Carl Munk and others. Certainly Graham Hancock, Robert Bovall have made claims of this nature, that the face on Mars at Cydonia is an artificial structure because, as I conclude in this paper, carving natural landforms into human and animal faces and heads is a distinctive Martian art form. And so that's, I think, the significance of that finding this summer, is that here's an area where there's not one face, but dozens of faces. And there's probably more that others will find when they start scrutinizing that photograph.
Excellent, Andy. Now let's flash forward to September of this past year, and I believe that Ross Curley, your chief photo analyst, had actually found something really interesting in one of the photos.
Right. Really, September of 2009 was really the banner year for our organization. 909 just ended up being a year of sort of consolidation, and three very significant things happened, both for me and for the organization. Ross joined us in spring of 2009 and just was doing incredibly gifted photo analysis really from the get-go. I mean, I felt cosmically blessed to become his friend and colleague, and I really give my thanks to Ross for what he's contributed to Mars research over the last year. It's incredible. The first thing he discovered was on day 2012, and everybody's waiting for what's going to happen in the year 2012, but on Mars day, or as they say, NASA calls a Martian day a Sol. So on Sol 2012, Spirit photographed a creature right in front of the rover. And the initial photograph that Ross found was of sort of an amphibian-looking face. It's sort of a mottled toad-like face that's looking at the camera. It almost looks like the rover's running over it. It's literally right in front of the rover. But then I said, Ross, try to find where this thing appears. I mean, it suddenly appears in this photograph. What happens to it? So he went through the photographs before and after that image, and he found something that literally astonished us, which is that it's not a matter of a terrestrial creature suddenly being confronted by the rover. In fact, what happens is the rover's sitting there, and this amphibian or toad-like, frog-like face suddenly appears in front of the rover. And then we found one photograph later where it sort of had blinked out, so we thought that was just the remnant of it running out of the way of the rover. But then I said, Ross, we don't know if, in fact, this is a terrestrial creature that's basically scampering out of the way of the rover, or just popping up and then running away. Try to get every photograph in this series. So when we did, and then we analyzed those photos, we found that what we had was basically a time series analysis of not a terrestrial creature suddenly appearing, but of an interdimensional being suddenly appearing. And then we have its intermittent physical state of existence where it morphs into sort of a thinner, more robot-like or scarecrow-like face, and then it blinks out. So what we published in September of 2009 is, I believe, the first reliable photographs comprising a time series analysis of an interdimensional being on another planet, literally transitioning between different physical states of existence. And so really, I mean, our hats are off to Ross for really making this finding. And my God, it's an incredibly significant finding, because it shows that, yes, not only is Mars inhabited with terrestrial creatures as we would understand them, but that the time-space that includes Mars, the quantum environment that includes Mars, includes interdimensional beings that are being photographed by NASA's digital cameras on the surface of Mars. And so you can find that paper from September where we present that time series analysis, and I actually wrote a caption, going, going, gone, because we have the toad-like face and then the scarecrow-like face, and then the face kind of disappears. And what's strange about that is that in some of these intermittent, interstitial kind of images, as the being is disappearing, its face is made up of a cluster of bodies, and there's some kind of light form. There's like an illuminated bulb at the top of the head. So what this creature is unlike anything that I believe has ever been photographed on Earth, and it also suggests that there are some very advanced life forms that are in the quantum environment that includes Mars and that we're now photographing.
Okay, now, Andy, would you like to discuss a little bit about the WebBot project that you have been referred in?
Well, this was a great honor. I don't want to sound too self-congratulatory. I thought, what preparation do I have besides being a lawyer? Lawyers are orators, so I guess I have a preparation that way for being a planetary whistleblower. I did play alto saxophone for 8 years when I was a kid, so maybe that also prepared me for this role as well. But basically what happened also in September of 2009 is that Cliff High at halfpasthuman.com operates something called the WebBot project, which is basically a spider that scans all the content on the World Wide Web for about 300,000 emotional trigger words. And then he uses a sophisticated software program called ALTA, which is Asymmetric Linguistic Trend Analysis. And he tries to use it as a predictive model for what the future holds. And going back for a year or so before I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, he had been predicting, well, I think 3 major trends. I think one was dollar decline, the other was Earth changes, and the third was space animal. And when I was writing my paper and consulting with Alfred Lambert Weber, we were joking about the fact that, hey, maybe you're one of the major whistleblowers regarding space animal. Well, what do you know? By September of 2009, about 9 months after I published my paper, Cliff High, summarizing his own data from ALTA, from the WebBot project, determined that I was the first of the 2 major planetary whistleblowers for my discovery of life on Mars. And that I was very flattered, and it was a great honor. I consider it a great honor and a high privilege, and I'm certainly going to try to live up to the honor and do what's right and continue my truth campaign. But one thing that Alfred and I kind of added to the discussion of this was, we don't think the ultimate role that I'm going to be playing per se is about life on Mars, because in fact, many people have been contributing to that subject for over a century. We think ultimately it's going to be my revelation of the fact that the U.S. government achieved quantum access to past and future events beginning around 1967-68. In other words, we think it's more of a dichotomous role that I'm going to be playing, both revealing my experiences in Project Pegasus in the early days of U.S. time travel research and development, and also the catalytic role I'm now trying to play around the fact that Mars is inhabited and that we need to promulgate an international treaty to protect Mars from exploration, habitation, and even colonization by human beings visiting Mars from Earth. So anyway, that's a great honor, and I thank Cliff High for that. And I'm just going to try to go about the mighty task of deserving that honor. But that's also something that happened sort of during this banner month of September 2009. And then finally, the month ended with something that nobody could predict, but something that I think is even more significant than our time series picture of the interdimensional being, and certainly of any role that I would be playing as a whistleblower. And that is a second discovery that the great Ross Curley made, our chief photo analyst from Mars. He was scrutinizing one of the Spirit photographs. I don't have the number right before me here, but the Spirit was rolling past a rock ledge, and it took a photograph of what was in front of it. And in the right corner of this sort of trapezoid-shaped rock ledge is an unmistakable image of an Egyptian pharaoh. It doesn't look like it was painted on the rock or stamped on it with a dye or a paint. It looks like it was either chiseled out of the rock or stamped out of metal. In other words, it's an intaglio into the rock. And it clearly shows the face not only of an Egyptian statue, of an Egyptian pharaoh, because of course I had found 3 heads with conical hats on them in image PIA 10214 that were identical to the hat that's on Nefertiti in the famous bust of her that the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt found at Amarna, Egypt in 1912. But in this image that Ross found carved into this rock, you can literally see the motif in the front center of the cylindrical hat, which is the cobra ready to strike motif called Wadjet. Wadjet was the Lord Protector of Lower Egypt, and Wadjet was a symbol of a god that protected all of Egypt during the reign of the pharaohs. So the principal discoveries we made in 2009, which sort of ended around September. I've been taking a hiatus, practicing law, doing some other things, doing some organizational tasks. But our discoveries in chief concluded in September this year with really a groundbreaking discovery that we owe to Ross Curley, which is literally now clear and convincing proof of this linkage between ancient Egypt and ancient Mars that previous researchers had indicated, but that we now have what I'm calling the Rosetta Stone of Mars, which is this image of an Egyptian pharaoh that's unmistakably identical to the thousands of images of Egyptian pharaohs that we find in the Egyptian artifacts. And so it was an incredible year that came full circle. In the same way that I had identified the sarcophagus of a pharaoh or a king laying on the right side of the home plate plateau almost a year ago, our year of discovery concluded with smoking gun evidence, literally an unmistakable image of an Egyptian pharaoh carved into a rock sitting right in front of the rover Spirit. So this American civilization has done something with its space program that is truly revolutionary. We have now demonstrated through photographic evidence not only that Mars was inhabited in antiquity and is inhabited today, but that the Martian civilization is connected to the civilization on Earth and in a very profound way.
Excellent, Andy. I know that we have a ton more questions for you, and I'm hoping that we can, within our next 19 minutes that we have with you, be able to address some of these questions with you. Would that be okay?
Sure, let's fire away.
Okay. In these discoveries, how is this going to affect JPL and NASA and future missions to Mars?
Well, I think as an immediate question, as a matter of first principles, I hope that my work will serve as a catalyst for NASA and JPL to create a public-oriented photo analytic division. We've been given the large panorama shots, even in full resolution JPEG. But what we haven't seen from NASA or JPL, indeed from the American government, is a public disclosure and education-oriented division of the space program that will present the kind of findings that a lawyer from Washington State and his highly spirited colleagues are trying to achieve at ProjectMars.net. I mean, this should be something that's coming from the government itself. You know, the reason that I sent my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, to the National Geographic Society back in December of last year is because the National Geographic Society and its magazine, National Geographic, are the leading public-oriented geographical institutions in the world. And I felt it was incumbent upon the Society to publish my data. And I didn't even receive a response from the leadership of the National Geographic Society. So I did what our founders and, you know, the framers of our Constitution, the founders of this great American civilization, would have urged me to do, what George Washington would have urged me to do, what Benjamin Franklin would have urged me to do, what Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or Thomas Paine or Patrick Henry would have urged me to do, which is to create my own society and take responsibility for the advance of science and the useful arts that is protected by our U.S. Constitution. You know, our mass public institutions, like the U.S. Congress, like the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, like the Jet Propulsion Lab, like the Smithsonian Institution, and indeed, like the National Geographic Society, they should be leading this effort. But what they've done is they've decided to sequester the truth and continue to put out pabulum, to continue to put out diluted data that will confuse the public about the true nature of things. You know, a month before I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, the National Geographic published a special edition entitled Space, the Once and Future Frontier. Well, wait a minute. What about the present frontier? Mm-hmm. What about publishing a journalistic analysis of what's in NASA's photographs of Mars from today? Not what we did in 1969 landing on the moon, not what we'll do in 2020 when we place permanent human settlements there, according to the official story. But what about what NASA is discovering in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010? What has happened is a default in our society. And what has occurred is that the organizations that should be leading this effort have been remiss in their responsibilities, and it's fallen to individuals like myself to take up the slack and do what our civilization should be doing publicly, which is showing the world what's on our neighboring planet of Mars. And so that's what I think will result at NASA and JPL, will hopefully be an internal change, some bureaucratic change that would be consistent with President Obama's call for change. And NASA doesn't have to stop what it's doing in terms of collecting this data, but it will have to change what it's doing in terms of analyzing this data and sharing it with the people of Earth. And that's what I will continue to try to lead that effort until NASA joins me in that cause.
Okay. Andy, one of the questions I personally have is, everyone's talking about I can even say it, colonization of Mars, okay? And my main question is how is this going to affect the flora, the plant life, the polar caps? How is this going to affect the ecosystem of Mars if this were to go forward?
I think that's the most significant question we should be asking. It's the most serious and potentially impacting dilemma that we're confronted by. You know, one of our most distinguished space scientists, and that's the second man to land on the moon, and indeed the space scientist who showed us how to land there, namely astronaut Buzz Aldrin, has called for the colonization of Mars. And in doing so, I think he's likely assuming that Mars does not possess an indigenous ecology and an indigenous civilization. But my evidence shows that it does. So even if we're to assume arguendo that claimants like myself, claimants like David Wilcock should not be, or Michael Relf, should not be believed that we've already placed teleportees on Mars, which is in fact the case. even if we were to basically embrace the official NASA, or for that matter, the Russian, the Chinese storyline that we will be going to Mars for the first time with human explorers by 2020, we have to ask literally the questions that you pose. What will be the impact on that very sensitive, that very fragile Martian ecology? An ecology where there are literally just the vestiges of vegetation after the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC. Do we have permission from the indigenous humanoids on Mars to not only visit and explore their planet, but to colonize their planet? I mean, certainly, if an extraterrestrial civilization came here and told us it would be colonizing Earth, I'm sure that the human governments and even indeed the individuals of Earth would consider that a casus belli, a cause for war. That an attempt to colonize Earth would potentially ignite an interplanetary war. Well, why are we so blithely concluding that our efforts, our projected goals of colonizing Mars would result in anything less? And in that sense, I believe that the work that I and others are doing about Mars may be very significant from an interplanetary security perspective. How do we know that the indigenous humanoid civilization on Mars, which evidence suggests is more advanced than us, would not profoundly resent and resist efforts by us to colonize their planet? We may risk interplanetary war if we go about the business of visiting and exploring and attempting to place human habitations on Mars without the permission and the cooperation of the Martian civilization. And so that's one of the most profound reasons why I'm speaking out. I'm concerned. I'm concerned that we're going to extend the doctrine of manifest destiny that led to the subjugation of the Native American peoples of this continent to the humanoids of the planet that every 2 years comes closest to Earth, namely the people of Mars. It was wrong when we did it to the Native Americans, and it will not only be wrong, but it could lead to interplanetary warfare and literally a planetary catastrophe if we try to subjugate the Martian population and colonize their planet.
I agree with you, Andy. One of the other questions that was posed in the chat room is, where does Andy see his research going in the coming years?
Well, hopefully, I know one thing. I mean, certainly I'm going to go for greater clarity, that is, greater visual resolution of my images. Because one of the unpleasant things I've discovered is that in this 2 years now of Mars photo analysis, is that there's no standard for video chip or screen technology in the computer revolution on Earth. There may be certain terms of art that photographers and designers of imaging software talk about. But if you were to invite 100 people within 100 miles of your residence into your living room or some gathering place in your town and have them look at my data with their laptops, you would get all manner of resolution of my images. Generally speaking, my PDFs of my images require an entertainment level PC to see clearly. And even when you can image my images clearly, I found there's something that I call PQ, which is somebody's perception quotient.
Mm-hmm.
People run the gamut from not only not being able to see a slightly blurry image of something to being able to tell you what the image is wearing. In other words, the ability of some people to connect the data coming into their optic system to their brain and then use their perceptual intelligence to tell you what they're seeing runs it's on a distribution, it's probably on a bell curve very similar to IQ. And so that means, I mean, look at the United States, the average IQ is 107. And so probably the average PQ is as well. In other words, half the people who you would put on that bell curve distribution of their ability to see what's in the images are going to fall below the average ability. Okay, so one of the unpleasant truths I've had to confront over the last 2 years is we're going to have to evolve superior imaging technology to show what's in the data. Because, for example, when I do a public lecture and I work off of a PowerPoint presentation that Alfred Weber and I have authored for Mars, about 3/4 of the attendees can see what I'm showing in the images. Mm-hmm. Certainly if the screen is illuminated properly. So that shows that when they're looking at my data, the majority of people agree with me. But out in the mass public, at least 50% of the people don't, because you have that averaging effect of everybody's screens being different. So the screens follow a bell curve distribution of clarity, and then the public itself follows a distribution of their perceptual quotient. So I'm only getting about 49, 50% agreement when my data is analyzed remotely, for example, by people looking at it on the internet. So that's something that we're going to have to put resources on, and that's going to be part of the fundraising thrust that I'm currently engaged in to fund Mars.
Okay, Andy, in our last 8 remaining minutes, what I'd love to do is touch base on your upcoming book, the cool things that you're doing over at your website, and some of the things that you're focusing on the new year. And I'm going to go ahead and just give you the floor to go ahead and tell our listeners about some of the things that you're working on.
Well, clearly I'm going to be lobbying Barack Hussein Obama, the 44th President of the United States, who I had the pleasure of meeting when we were only 20 years old, when I was at UCLA and he was in Los Angeles after he had spent a year at Columbia. He was in Los Angeles visiting his friends from Occidental College. So the President and I are acquaintances. We met back in 1982, and I'm going to reestablish that acquaintanceship, and I'm going to be sending the President a letter that's going to be published on our website and distributed through a PR newswire, asking the President to affirm my discovery of life on Mars as a great accomplishment of the American civilization that not only I can take credit for, but more importantly, our brave astronauts and our highly talented engineers and technicians at NASA and JPL should take credit for, because this discovery is not just mine. I mean, I was lucky. You know, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a space scientist. I just got lucky finding this data and even having the intelligence community brief me as a child about the fact that I was going to find it. Okay, so that's just personal good fortune that I've had. More importantly, our American civilization has to own this discovery. It has to claim credit for it, and it has to play a more democratic role in disseminating it. And since this president, who is literally my contemporary, the president's I think about 44, 45 days older than me. He was born in August of 1961. I was born in mid-September of 1961. So we're contemporaries. And in the same way that the great agitator Frederick Douglass wrote to Abraham Lincoln urging abolition, I'm going to be writing to President Obama urging disclosure. And specifically, I'm going to be urging disclosure of the evidence that now proves that Mars is an inhabited planet. So that's going to be a major task for the coming year. On the time travel front, I'm also going to be calling on Secretary Rumsfeld and Governor Richardson to step forward, as I described on Coast to Coast AM, to come forward and acknowledge their involvement in Project Pegasus. Because I believe that teleportation is going to be one of the great opportunities that we're going to have in the 21st century to transform the infrastructure of human civilization on Earth and also continue to reach other celestial bodies. Now, specifically in my Mars research, we have 2 major discoveries among, oh God, I mean, Ross and I have talked about this. I've got 10 leads on my desktop that I have to craft into research papers. We've got about 25 other major findings to share with the public, but let me just share 2 of them with you to give you a measure of the depth of what we have in our files that are going to be part of our research and disclosure efforts in 2010. One thing we've found is that we believe that the face on Mars at Cydonia has been misinterpreted. And it's almost comic how it's been misinterpreted. It's been misinterpreted by being turned upside down, just like a photograph of somebody's face could be on Earth. We believe that the face on Mars, Cydonia, doesn't show a human face. It doesn't show a lion's face or a monkey's face. We believe it shows the face of a gray extraterrestrial type being, but that when it's been interpreted, it's been misinterpreted by 180 degrees. That is to say, when you invert the face on Mars at Cydonia, as it's characteristically been analyzed, and you look at the part of that mesa or that mountain that makes it up, and you cast the side that remains over to the other side and try to rebuild the face from the part of that monument that was destroyed, what you find is a face that's very similar to the faces of the gray extraterrestrials that appear in the UFO contact literature. So I'm soon going to be publishing a piece that's going to show that fact, that we believe the face on Mars is a face, but it's a face where the data has been inverted 180 degrees and actually shows a face with far more of a bulbous head and a neoteny in its features, namely an embryonic or infantile size and orientation of its facial features. So we hope that's going to contribute an interesting lead to the whole discussion about the face on Mars at Cydonia, which has such an iconic role in the whole ongoing literature regarding what's on Mars. The other thing that we're going to do, another major discovery that we've made, is of the fact that everybody's been acquainted with the so-called glass tubes on Mars. In fact, Miles O'Brien, the great science reporter for CNN, before he left CNN in December of last year, right around the time I was publishing my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, did his final piece as a science reporter for CNN before CNN fired its entire science desk. And what it was about were the forms on Mars that look like big glass tubes that could be anything from igneous rock that's poured out of seams on the surface that has a glassine or silicon base to it, or they could be exoskeletons of worms deposited in crevices of rocks and so forth. What we believe, however, they are artificial glass structures, and what we're going to be publishing are forms that we've analyzed inside the glass tubes that we believe are of humanoids looking out from inside the glass tubes. So one of our major disclosures in the early part of 2010 here is going to be to add to the debate over the glass tubes on Mars and present our initial findings that they're artificial structures similar to what might exist, for example, at an airport on Earth, where you have a glass causeway or a big picture window where members of the general public will stand and look out at the planes coming in and leaving the airport. Mm-hmm. But we think these are artificial glass tubes that allow human inhabitants of the Martian underground to walk up into the tubes on the surface of Mars and look out on the terrestrial surface of the red planet.
Incredible, Andy. Incredible. We only have 1 minute left, and I don't want you to be cut off because this is amazing. This is amazing what you're sharing with us. So we got 90 seconds, Andy. Go ahead and give your website and email address real quick.
Okay. Well, our Mars findings of the Mars Anomaly Research Society, of myself, Alfred Weber, and our new associates like Ross Curtley and Paul Goodwin of the United Kingdom. We're going to be reporting about Antonio De Bello's findings in Italy, are at www.projectmars.net. My Pegasus revelations and my disclosure effort around teleportation are at our companion website, which is www.projectpegasus.net. And then I maintain 3 sites on Facebook. I would invite your listeners to join my personal site, which is Andrew D. BASIAGO. You can just search me on Facebook. And then we have 2 Facebook groups that link to my personal site and to those 2 other websites, which are entitled The Discovery of Life on Mars, which is a Facebook group site, and then Project Pegasus is also one of our Facebook group sites. So if you want to remain in contact with me personally and become part of our research efforts, those are the 5 websites that I would invite your listeners to visit.
Excellent, Andy. This has been fabulous. We look forward to doing a part 2 and a part 3 with you, perhaps, if you would be open to that.
I certainly would. Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to further conversations with you, Sandy.
Excellent, Andy. You've been listening to Other World Radio.